Yes, recessive deleterious mutations are probably what explains Joffrey here. But optimal outbreeding theory predicts that there'll be selection for adaptations that regulate your mating motivation, so how attractive another person seems to you as a potential sexual partner, but in relation to cues of kinship. So avoiding very close kin and potentially avoiding extremely distant kin. So there's some interesting research in Iceland where they know the genetic relationships among absolutely everybody on the island that suggests that the optimal mate is they use either third to fourth cousins, people who they have long genealogies, and people who are more closely related than that had fewer children and grandchildren than people who were more distantly related. And third to fourth cousins, so sharing a great-great-grandparent or a great-great-great-grandparent. So basically people that you've probably never met before. Seemed to be optimal for, at least by the second generation. Okay. Now, your genetic relatedness to others isn't always obvious, as we talked about before, especially in mammals who can have paternity uncertainty. So the first step then to relatedness contingent behavior is having some kind of mechanism to detect cues that are typically associated with genetic relatedness. So what are the potential cues that humans, that people could use for kin recognition? The main topic of study in my lab is facial resemblance. So in humans, when we talk about family resemblance, what we usually mean is that relatives' faces tend to look similar. Now, in psychology, we often say that people study what they have or what they lack. And one of the reasons that I study kin recognition is because for most of my life, at least up until 11 years ago, I entirely lacked genetic relatives. I was adopted, and adopted into a family where a lot of the kids are adopted. My sister and 6 of my cousins, all adopted from different families, and I have 6 other cousins who are genetically DeBryans. DeBryans have a quite big nose, and I always really envied it. My cousins who have it hated it. I always wanted to look like a DeBryan. But 11 years ago, I made myself a genetic relative. Actually, that's me on the left as a baby, and that's my son, who's 11 now. And our baby pictures, you can hardly tell the difference between them. But my kind of interest in family, what makes people feel like they're family, even when they're not actually genetically related, and they know that for sure. What is it that, my sister is definitely my sister, and we have all the same kind of relationship as sisters who are genetically related. So what was it about that when I've always known, ever since we went to when I was small, I thought it was the baby shop, but it was actually the orphanage. We went and got her from the baby shop and brought her home, and I thought that was how everybody got little sisters. And I asked my parents if we could maybe take her back. And they didn't cry so much. So this interest has led me to think about all the different cues we use and about family resemblance, but I'm an experimentalist at heart. I want to be able to experiment, and you can't very well, experimentally take babies and swap them about at birth and see how they grow up. It takes too long in humans. People do it with ground squirrels, and there's fascinating research on that. But it's not very ethical, not very practical. So I learned how to use computer graphics to generate virtual brothers and virtual sisters for people. Take a picture of your face and then manipulate it to make somebody who looks enough like you that they could be a sibling, but is a person that you don't know. And so I'm going to explain a few details of the computer graphic methods that we use in the lab for manipulating facial resemblance and used in experimental studies. I'll show you how I would generate a virtual sister and a virtual brother for Cersei here. So first what we do is mark out the physical structure of Cersei's face and also an average same-sex face. Mark about 200 corresponding points on each face, and then an average is made from about 20 faces that are marked in the same way. Then program, and you can play with this program yourself. It's one that I've developed called WebMorph. It's at webmorph.org. The program compares the 2 templates. As you can see, Cersei here, she's got fuller lips and more asymmetric lips than the average woman, and a kind of longer septum in her nose, and lots of other little differences, but the computer can pick up all of those differences. And And it can then manipulate any third face by the shape differences between one individual face and the average face. You can increase or decrease these shape cues in any third face then. So you can increase or decrease the cues that are unique to that individual. We don't change color cues in these third faces because it causes facial hair artifacts when you make virtual sisters for men who have anything other than exactly average facial hair. You can cause sort of shaded beards or anti-beards if they have less facial hair than average, which looks weird on the female sisters. All right, so here I can make a virtual sister by transforming an average same-sex face. And I typically increase shape resemblance by 50% of the difference between the individual and the average. So while I originally chose this figure to be the largest difference that I could make without people spontaneously guessing that these were images manipulated to look like them, recent work from Tommaso Querci and Iris Holzleitner in my lab has actually shown that people's ability to perceive relatedness for virtual siblings in this way, if I showed you a whole bunch of faces like that, asked you guess, are they siblings or not, and sometimes the face was their virtual sibling and sometimes it wasn't, people's ability to detect that is almost exactly the same as their ability to detect whether real siblings are related or not. So I think it's a pretty equivalent manipulation to the amount of facial resemblance you typically see between siblings. And I can also change, though, an average male face in the same way. So importantly, since we're only changing the shape cues that make that individual person different from an average same-sex person, so using this method to manipulate other sex faces doesn't make them look more androgynous like it would if you simply blended an average male face with Circe's individual female face. This is a method that's been used in some other research to investigate kinship cues. But that means then that all of the other sex virtual siblings are more androgynous than the same-sex virtual siblings and introduces a confound. But here now we have got a virtual sister and a virtual brother for Circe. And I'll also make virtual siblings for a second, what we call yoked participant, here represented by Daenerys. And that person is matched to the first participant for sex, ethnicity, and approximate age. Okay. So I can then measure responses to self-resemblance by taking the number of, say, instances on which somebody chose their own virtual sibling as more attractive looking or more trustworthy looking. I can take their scores for their own virtual sibling and subtract from that their yoked participants' responses to that same face. So this yoked control method, we'll be using it in all the studies I'll talk about today, which is why I'm going over it in a lot of detail. But it gives you a measure of self-resemblance bias that isn't confounded by differences in, say, attractiveness or other characteristics between groups. So for example, let's say I had male and female participants come into the lab. And the female participants were much more attractive than the male participants on average. If I didn't use such a yoke control design, what I might falsely conclude is that women think self-resembling faces are a lot more attractive than men do, when actually it's just a difference between those two groups and their self-resembling faces look like them, so they reflect characteristics of those groups. But with the yoke control design, even if one group is systematically different from another group, I'm only measuring how much more or less, say, attractive or trustworthy people find their own virtual sibling than other people in their group find that same face. So in the first study where I used this technique, I looked at attractiveness judgments of same and other sex self-resembling faces. So after all of this effort they put into to make personalized stimuli for every participant, the experimental task was really easy. Participants were just asked to choose which face in a pair was more attractive. And their own virtual sibling was paired up with their yoked participant's virtual sibling. And they did this for female faces and for male faces. And what we found was a significant interaction here. So in case this isn't clear, the blue bars are male faces and the red bars are female faces. We tested 53 men and 55 women. And the y-axis is the self-resemblance bias. So positive scores just mean that the person chose their own virtual sibling as more attractive than their yoked participant's virtual sibling, more often, or more strongly than their yoked participant did. Okay. So we find an interaction where self-resemblance increased the attractiveness of same-sex virtual siblings, but not other sex virtual siblings. So consistent with this idea that that self-resemblance is a cue of kinship, and that cues of kinship decrease potential sexual interest. And our participants here were all straight, which is important when we're talking about potential sexual interest only with other sex bases. So this is the graph that I published in 2004, and I've subsequently learned just how misleading that sort of bar plot is. So as part of the activist part of this talk, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to present data in a much better format that I would encourage you all to learn about, and just bar plots from your research. This is the exact same data. These look a little bit different, and so I'll help orient you to it. Box plots you're probably familiar with. They're just the traditional box plots, marking out the median and quartile, interquartile range. But the lumpy shapes are called violin plots. They're like really fine-grained histograms, but turned on their side and centered. So the box plots are superimposed on top because they tend to be more familiar, but the violin plots give you an idea of the whole distribution of the data. Now the interaction, still the same significant interaction here. It looks a lot less impressive than when you only show the means, but there's lots of research that suggests that like when people show bar plots, even when you know for sure that this is a bad idea, people perceive data points inside of the bar to be more likely than data points above the bar, even though the bar itself is at the mean. Box plots give us much better intuitions about the spread of the data than bar plots do. And also, you'll see a lot of links like this, OSF links. You can access the data and all of the code for this study at the Open Science Framework link here. So you can get the code that generates these plots, you can get the data from the original study, you can reanalyze it, do whatever you want with it. I've started a project to make all of my old data and analyses open access, and it's going pretty slowly, but most of the talks, or most of the studies I'll talk about today have open data. And all the slides for this talk are posted online, and I will get you the URL through Amanda if you want as well. All right, so that first study suggested that people might be using facial resemblance as a kinship cue in accordance with predictions from optimal outbreeding theory, so that people who weren't attracted to same-sex people thought that same-sex virtual siblings looked way more attractive than average. But there are other people who were attracted to other sex individuals, they didn't think their other sex virtual siblings looked more attractive than average. It's only really suggestive evidence, so we ran a number of follow-up studies. So in another study, I showed people the same types of face pairs, but asked them to choose which face looked more trustworthy, which looked more attractive for a long-term relationship like marriage, and which looked more attractive for a short-term relationship like a one-night stand. So we only tested heterosexual participants in this study as well, and only showed them other sex bases. And what we found was that self-resemblance increased perceptions of trustworthiness for these other sex bases, because what we were worried about in the first study was maybe you don't perceive self-resemblance as well in other sex bases as in same-sex bases, and that could have confounded the results. We ran a control study where we looked at perceptions of averageness in that one, which I didn't present the graphs to you, but self-resemblance increased averageness perceptions in both same-sex and other sex bases. So we thought that wasn't really the explanation, but ran this follow-up study as well. And so we found that self-resemblance increased trustworthiness perceptions, had no real effect on long-term attractiveness, but significantly decreased short-term attractiveness perceptions. So people thought that self-resembling faces were actually unappealing, significantly less appealing than normal for a one-night stand. So these two studies are both consistent with the idea that people might use facial resemblance as a cue of kinship, even in strangers, and that in line with inclusive fitness theory, they respond to this cue of kinship with increased pro-social attributions like trustworthiness, and in line with optimal outbreeding theory, respond with decreased sexual attributions. Right. So another main research area in my lab is how hormones affect our social perceptions. And there's two main hypotheses for how hormonal changes across women's menstrual cycles might be related to the social perception of kinship cues. So first one is the incest avoidance hypothesis. So this is the idea that women will avoid male kin, specifically when conception risk or fertility is highest, because that's when the costs of inbreeding are highest. When your fertility is lowest across the menstrual cycle and you're probably not able to get pregnant, then the costs of incest, inbreeding are much lower. Lieberman, Pillsworth, and Hazelton came up with this idea, and they tested it using mobile phone records and demonstrated that women make fewer phone calls to their, fewer phone calls, and they spend less time on the phone to their fathers relative to their mothers on days of the month when they were most fertile, so around the days of ovulation. That's the, sorry, this is not showing up very well here, but the left side of the graph is the low fertility part of the menstrual cycle when they were tested. The right part of the graph is the high fertility part. So the red lines are their average number of calls per day and average minutes calling per day to their mothers. And the blue lines are for their fathers. So you can see during the high fertility phase, their phone call length and duration to mothers stayed about the same, maybe went up a little bit, but length and duration to their fathers decreased at high fertility. And they interpreted this as reflecting incest avoidance. You have less motivation to be around male relatives at high fertility. But I thought there was another potential reason that behavior towards kin might vary across the menstrual cycle. So some non-human animals, like mice, seek out genetic relatives when they're pregnant, possibly in order to obtain alloparental care from kin. So mice will do nesting with their sisters and feed each other's offspring. So in a study that I published in 2005 with Ben Jones and Dave Parrott, we had tested whether changes in preferences for self-resembling faces, whether those changes across the menstrual cycle in preferences for self-resembling faces, did they better fit this incest avoidance hypothesis or the kin affiliation hypothesis? And what we found was that preferences for facial kinship cues were greatest in the low fertility part of the menstrual cycle, in that they tracked changes in progesterone. So progesterone is a hormone that's closely linked with pregnancy. It increases in the latter, less fertile part of the menstrual cycle, but it also increases a lot in early pregnancy. So we thought possibly this menstrual cycle change might be an artifact of kin affiliation during pregnancy. And what we also found was that, new, there we go. That's weird, okay. So we have low fertility and high fertility here on these graphs. Sorry about the font here. I almost can't. All right. So, and the y-axis here is now self-resemblance preference. The red lines are for female faces, and the blue lines are for male faces. And so we see here that the effect's stronger for female faces, actually. The difference from low fertility to high fertility in preference for self-resemblance seems real specific to female faces. The top graph is younger female faces, so about the same age. The bottom graph is older male and female faces, so sort of the participant's parental age. But we thought these data support the kin affiliation hypothesis more so than the inbreeding avoidance hypothesis. If these changes in responses to kinship cue were actually about avoiding inbreeding, you expect them to be stronger for male faces than for female faces, right? But both of these studies used a diary method for estimating high and low fertility days. And so they don't address potential hormonal mechanisms really for the effects. I'll show you a schematic version of variation in hormone levels across the menstrual cycle. So from the low fertility of menses on the left to the high fertility follicular phase in the middle, near ovulation, and then the low fertility luteal phase on the right. So the blue line shows how estradiol increases until ovulation, then decreases, but increases again during the luteal phase. And the yellow line shows how progesterone is very low until after ovulation, increases during the luteal phase. If pregnancy occurs, then it continues to increase. If implantation doesn't occur, progesterone decreases and triggers the start of another menstrual cycle. So the incest avoidance hypothesis predicts that it's most important to avoid male kin at times of high fertility and increases conception risk, right? So sexual perceptions of kin issues in men specifically should be decreased during this time. So the main hypothesized hormonal correlate of fertility here is the ratio between progesterone and estradiol, which is highest near ovulation. But alternatively, the kin affiliation hypothesis predicts that it's most important to seek out kin, seek care from kin during pregnancy. So pro-social perceptions of female kin are predicted to be highest during hormonal states that are similar to pregnancy. So when progesterone is high in the luteal phase. These are the two different predictions made by these two hypotheses in relation to hormones that vary across the menstrual cycle. So, and as part of a 5-year project that was headed by Ben Jones on broader issues of hormones and social perception, we tested the social perception of virtual brothers and virtual sisters for 176 women on 4 separate occasions across their menstrual cycle. And we collected saliva to measure progesterone and estradiol, rather than estimating this from diary data like the previous studies. And participants made attractiveness and trustworthiness judgments of their own virtual sibling and also their yoke control person's virtual sibling. So the same design we've been using over and over. So to test the incest avoidance hypothesis, we looked at attractiveness judgments of male faces, which is the blue line here. And remember, the hypothesis predicts that self-resemblance bias will decrease as the estradiol to progesterone ratio increases with increasing conception risk, right? And our findings didn't support this hypothesis. They were actually significantly in the opposite direction to the prediction. The p-value here is not significant, but the there was no SF link, but there's a link up to the preprint where we've expanded the data collection to participants in the second half of the study. So there's more participants, and this is actually a significant result, but in the opposite direction to what you predict. So really no support whatsoever for the incest avoidance hypothesis here. To test the kin affiliation hypothesis, we looked at prosocial judgments of female faces, so the red line. And remember that this hypothesis predicts that self-resemblance bias will increase as progesterone increases to prepare the body for pregnancy. And we found an effect that was consistent with this hypothesis for virtual sisters who were judged as more trustworthy and more attractive when progesterone was higher. Okay. So, no, there's the preprint link. So the data and the analysis code for this study are linked in the preprint, and the paper is currently under review. The reviewers have asked for different analyses, more data, so we'll be updating all of that pretty soon. But all of the new analyses we're doing come to the same conclusions. So really I don't have any useful advice for avoiding incest based on the results of this study. It does seem that hormonal regulation of perceptions of kinship cue don't really have anything to do with incest. But instead seem to be related to within-woman changes in hormones that are related to pregnancy, not fertility. And therefore the changes that we see across the menstrual cycle probably don't actually have anything to do with the menstrual cycle and are just a low-cost, functionless byproduct of adaptations related to pregnancy. So, facial resemblance is what we call a phenotypic kinship cue. And it's something you don't necessarily need any prior experience with an individual to detect. A contextual kinship cue. A contextual cue refers to behaving differently towards individuals who are encountered in different contexts, and contexts that are more or less likely to contain kin. So co-residents, or growing up in the same household, and the length and timing of living together, they've been shown to influence cognitions that are related to prosociality and sexual motivations. This is often referred to as the Westermark effect. So where children who live together in early childhood, regardless of their actual relatedness or even their own knowledge about their relatedness, these children see each other as inappropriate mates when they grow up. So perhaps Theon and Yara should have spent more time together as children. So an interesting piece of evidence for the Westermark effect is in studies of Simpua marriage. So this was a practice in Thailand where young girls were sent to live with their future husband, so often from very young ages, like 2 or 3. And historic records show that these marriages had unusually low fertility rates, especially when the couple started living together before the age of 5. So Marcella and Tristan were probably safe. But, as I said before, if you don't live in Westeros, it's really quite difficult to study inbreeding avoidance by documenting actual cases of incest. And you can't just ask people, say, to rate on a scale from 1 to 7, how much do you want to sleep with your sibling? Is anybody here prepared to say anything other than -10? Right. So, Deb Lieberman came up with a really creative way to assess relative incest aversion by making moral judgments that aren't about your own feelings, but they're about other people's behavior. She made a randomly ordered list of acts of various morality and asked participants to just rank order the list from most morally wrong to least morally wrong. Okay, so 2 of these acts involve consensual sibling incest. And she then correlated the sum of the ranks given to these 2 items with the number of years that people had lived with siblings of each sex. So for example, if a woman has 2 brothers, and she lived with for, say, 10 and 12 years, her total co-residence with brothers would be 22 years. And what Deb found was that the moral wrongness of sibling incest was correlated with the length of co-residence, with brothers for women and with sisters for men, but not with same-sex siblings. In my lab, we've repeated this task with a fairly large number of people across a bunch of different projects over the past few years. So here's the mean ranks of the items from almost 4,000 women. So in the study I'm going to show you now, we also looked at the items about parent-child incest. So father-daughter incest for women, and mother-son incest for men. So we always get fewer men volunteering for studies, both in the lab and online. But we have, about 1,000 men here. Of those, 5,000 participants, about 2,000 of the men and women who completed this ranking had also completed a sibling questionnaire for some part of a study in the lab. We cut our sample size down, though, much further because we restricted analyses to heterosexual people who only had full siblings and who only had siblings of a single sex. This left us with 666 people, but we discovered one further problem. So there's some sex differences on average in the middle rankings, but people consistently agree on where are the 3 most morally wrong and the 3 least morally wrong items. I'm assuming every single one of you knows which of those 3 is the most morally wrong, which is the least morally wrong, right? Is anyone confused about this? Okay. So we summed the ranks of these items and took the difference score to create a kind of moral compass score. Your score should be real high. You should say that the 3 top are the most morally wrong of everything. 3 on the bottom, not a big deal. But then we graphed this moral compass score. I can definitely recommend, when you get some data, you're going to do a study, you finish your study, you've got your data. Graph everything, because you will find that some weird things are happening in your data, almost certainly. And this will help you figure out what's going on with outliers, if people misunderstand what was going on with your study. Just graph everything. As is usual for large online studies, there's a small proportion of people who seem to be randomly responding. In the middle in red, just randomly rank ordering things. And their data usually wash out. That's no big deal. But we're really surprised by this group in yellow. It's a noticeable proportion who are systematically responding, but totally backwards. We couldn't tell, though, if these people were confused. We said rank order from most to least morally wrong. Maybe they just did it from least to most. Or if they most to least goes bottom up. Who knows? Or maybe they were just trolling us. So we removed the 82 participants who had moral compass scores less than 25. So just sort of visually looking at where are most people and get rid of the tail end. This left us with 582 participants. Okay, so this graph's gonna be a little complicated. I'll orient you to the whole graph first, and then I'll show you the data. The y-axis is the moral wrongness score. So low numbers mean that people rank the incest items as relatively less wrong. Well, high numbers mean they rank the incest items as relatively more wrong. You're going to see comparisons of incest scores for women who only have sisters versus women who only have brothers. And then for men who only have sisters and men who only have brothers. So these are a variation on the violin plots you saw before. This time, the left half of the violin is applying the distribution from people who only have sisters, and the right half of the violin is applying the distribution from people who only have brothers. So you can see whether or not the gender of the sibling is making any difference. The important thing to take away from this graph is that there was a significant three-way interaction among target, so whether it was the sibling incest score we're looking at or the parent incest score, sex, and sibling sex. So what we need to do is really look at the two types of incest scores separately. If we just look at sibling incest, we replicate this pattern shown by Lieberman. Right, so women with brothers rank sibling incest as more wrong. This is not just for themselves, but just wrong in general, than women with sisters. Whereas men with brothers rank sibling incest as less wrong than men with sisters. But now for the parent-child incest items, we don't see a significant interaction between sex and sibling sex. The effects that we see are in the same direction, but they're less than half the effect size. So we can conclude that, for heterosexual people at least, growing up with other sex siblings is related to moral sentiments that might help you to avoid sibling incest, but not avoid parent-child incest. And this finding addresses several alternative explanations for Lieberman's original findings, such as people were speculating that individuals who have more siblings might have systematically different moral intuitions just in general, for reasons that are totally unrelated to their siblings specifically, but maybe related to just having more siblings in general. You can have more years of co-residence if you have more siblings. If you're an only child or only have one sibling, there's a limit to how many years of co-residence you can have with them. What some students in my lab are also doing, the data that we collected online, I said that we limited our analysis to only participants who indicated that they were only attracted to other sex people. We're expanding out our data collection because there wasn't enough data to do any statistical analyses of people who have same-sex attraction. We're now going to look at specifically only gay men and lesbians and look at whether the patterns here are entirely reversed, in that if you have same-sex attraction, is it only same-sex siblings that's related to your moral intuitions about incest? Or is it still other sex siblings? If it's still other sex siblings, that might indicate that really what we're seeing here is more about parental messages about incest. So maybe if you don't have any other sex siblings, and your parents assume that you're going to grow up straight, they don't bother to tell you, don't commit incest with your same-sex siblings. And it won't matter what sexual orientation you end up, that you will or you won't get the parental messages just based on your family composition. Maybe people with other sex siblings are just more likely to get more early messages against incest than people who only have same-sex siblings. So that's what some students in my lab are looking at now. All right, so with that, I'd like to conclude by thanking some people. A special, very special thanks goes out to the top row is my Game of Thrones watching group, who got me into this massive TV show, and associated colleagues. These are all my inspirations and my bad influences, and I would thank them very much, especially Amanda. Get me out here. And these are people all in the face. This is the FACE Research Lab. They normally look more alive than this, but it's a pretty big lab, and I need to thank them all so much for helping to make all of the studies possible, especially the members of the Kinship Project across the top. You can find links to preprints of everything, open data, open code, tools for making your own face transformations, if you want to make your own virtual siblings, and tutorials for fancy violin plots through all the websites above, and you can always email me for help on any of that as well. And just before I end, tomorrow, is it lunchtime? Yeah, 12 to 1. 12 to 1, I will be talking informally, formally. I'm going to be talking a lot about open science stuff, and especially the Psychological Science Accelerator, which is a worldwide network of psychologists who are doing research to make sure that the kind of psychology we do isn't just about Western undergraduate students. So I'll be talking about all of that, and also about what we can all do to make our science more open and share data and code and make everything more reproducible, which is the other thing apart from incest that I'm really passionate about. So thanks very much for your attention.